The morning they came to make her an offer she would never accept, Clara Voss stood at the fence line of her 40 acres and did not turn around. She heard the motor car before she saw it, the way sound carries flat and far across low ground in November, and she let the engine noise arrive and idle and go quiet behind her before she moved so much as a shoulder. Rutherford Gaines stepped out of that car in a wool coat that cost more than most men in the county earned in a month, and he walked toward her across the frosted stubble with 2 men flanking him and a leather satchel under his arm, and the expression of a person who has rehearsed his charity so many times it has curdled into contempt. She could hear him breathing hard from the walk. She did not turn. She kept her eyes on the ground where the hogs were moving in the pale light, 12 of them, broad and dark and deliberate, pushing their flat snouts into the earth with the patience of something that cannot be hurried. Gaines stopped a few feet short of her and cleared his throat and said, in the voice he used for people he pitied, that he was prepared to be generous, that the offer stood at $4,200 and that she ought to take it before winter made a fool of her again. Clara Voss was quiet for a long time. Then she said, without turning, "The land is not for sale." And that was the whole of it. Gaines stood behind her with his satchel and his 2 men, and the silence spread out between them like water finding its level, and it unnerved him the way silence always unnerved men who made their living on noise. What happened next, what the ground gave up that winter, and what it cost Rutherford Gaines to learn the difference between a price and a worth, is a story that begins 4 years earlier and 1,000 miles from where anyone expected Clara Voss to end up. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? 4 years earlier, the county had judged her mad, and they had not been quiet about it. They said so at the feed store and at the grain elevator and across the back fences of every farm that bordered the parcel she had bought. And they said it with the particular confidence of people who have never been wrong about anything they could remember. $300 for 40 acres of bottomland that flooded every wet spring, that had not produced a profitable crop in 11 years, that sat low and dark and waterlogged on the southeast edge of the county where the limestone shelf dipped below grade and the topsoil was thin as a rumor. The previous owner, a man named Pruitt, who had spent 6 years fighting the ground and lost, sold it to Clara in late October for exactly $300 and shook her hand once and drove away without looking back. She watched him go, and then she stood alone on the 40 acres in the cold and listened to the land. She was 41 years old, and she had arrived in Harlan County with a rented wagon, $200 remaining after the purchase, her late husband's hand tools wrapped in canvas in the wagon bed, and a cast-iron pan that had fed her through 11 months of grief. Edmund Voss had been dead since the previous November, taken by a fever that moved faster than the doctor could reason about it, and Clara had sold their Missouri farm for enough to clear the debts, and had enough left over for the $300 and the wagon and the canvas-wrapped tools, and $200 more. She had no children at that time, and no kin within 400 miles, and no plan that anyone would have recognized as such. What she had was an eye for a certain quality in broken things, an eye that had been given to her by 30 years of learning to see past the surface of whatever she was looking at. And that eye had looked at the Pruitt bottomland and seen something the county could not see and was not inclined to try. The land was low, yes. The land flooded, yes. The limestone shelf ran 8 to 12 feet down through most of the parcel, and the clay subsoil above it held water badly, and the grass that grew there was coarse and pale, and the trees at the low edge stood with their roots half exposed, where erosion had cut the bank. None of that was wrong. But Clara Voss had grown up on ground not unlike this in central Tennessee, had watched her father run hogs on bottomland that other farmers dismissed, And she had seen what hogs do to low wet ground when you let them work it the way they want to work it, which is to say with their whole bodies and their whole attention, pushing and turning and eating and churning. And she had seen that ground produce, over time, something extraordinary in the way of root vegetables and eventually grain, because hogs improve what they touch if you manage them with patience and do not rush what cannot be rushed. She spent the first 3 days walking every inch of the 40 acres. She wore her husband Edmund's boots because they were sturdier than her own and came above the ankle where the ground was soft, and she walked a grid she had mapped on paper the night before, 40 paces wide, turning at the fence line and coming back, bending low every few yards to push her fingers into the soil and pull up a handful and smell it and feel its weight and its drainage and its particular texture between her palms. On the second day she found something that made her stop and crouch for a long time in the pale October grass. She did not dig at it then. She pressed the soil back with the heel of her hand, smoothed it flat, and stood up and walked on. She kept the arithmetic of the land in a small leather notebook she carried in her coat pocket, figures written in her careful hand. Depth of good soil, depth to clay, presence of iron smell, direction of drainage, angle of the limestone ledge as she could estimate it from the surface. She did not share this notebook with anyone. There was one person in the county who understood the kind of seeing Clara Voss was doing, and that was a man named Benedek Farkas, who had come from Hungary 30 years before and farmed a small place on the ridge above the bottomland, growing vegetables and keeping bees and speaking English with a cadence that made some people dismiss him because they had to listen carefully. He was 67 years old and had been watching the Pruitt bottomland from his ridge for a decade, watching it the way a patient man watches a thing he has some theory about. And when he saw Clara arrive and begin her slow grid walk, he came down from the ridge on the third day and stood at the fence line until she looked up at him. He said, "You are looking at it from the inside. Good. Most people look at broken land from the road and decide from there." He had a way of delivering a statement like that as though it were the most ordinary observation in the world, not a maxim, just a fact, and then going quiet. Clara looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "There is iron in the low corner." Benedek Farkas nodded. He said, "The broken place is where the iron comes through. The wound is where the vein runs." She wrote that down in her notebook that evening, not in his words exactly, but close enough that she could hear his voice when she read it back. The wound is where the vein runs. It became the arithmetic by which she reasoned about everything that followed. She built her house that first winter from salvaged lumber and her own hands. A tight, small house of 4 rooms set on the highest corner of the 40 acres, dry ground, good drainage, with a root cellar dug 8 feet into the clay and lined with flat limestone she pried from the creek bank. She worked from first light to last light through November and December, and some days the temperature dropped far enough that the mud around the foundation froze solid by mid-morning, and she worked the afternoon in frozen ground with a pickaxe and an adze and the particular focus of a person who has nothing to lose by effort and everything to lose by stopping. The county watched. They watched from the road and from the ridge above, and they talked about the widow Voss the way people talk about someone they have already written off, with a mixture of pity and the faint relief of people who need someone else's failure to feel safe in their own choices. In January, she acquired the Hogs. She found them through Benedek Farkas, who knew a man 2 counties east who was selling out his operation and needed to move a small herd of mixed-breed rooting hogs, not the fashionable kind, not the improved breeds that men like Rutherford Gaines kept in clean pens and showed at fairs, but a rough, heavy, dark-bristled variety that was the result of years of crossing whatever was available with whatever survived, hogs that were built low and wide and strong in the shoulder and utterly indifferent to cold and wet and poor forage, hogs that would eat what a better-bred animal would refuse, and root where a finer animal would quit. She paid $47 for the original 9. She brought them home on a borrowed wagon in the last week of January, their breath steaming in the cold, their small eyes bright and unafraid, and she turned them onto the low 40 and stepped back and watched them go to work. The girl came in February. Her name was Edie Marsh. She was 9 years old, and she had attached herself to Clara with the quiet determination of a child who has found the only thing in a given landscape worth attaching to. She lived on the farm 3 properties north with a grandmother who was kind but worn thin by age and could not watch the child every hour. And Edie began appearing at Clara's fence line in the mornings, standing in the cold, watching the hogs, saying nothing. Clara fed her biscuits and coffee with a great deal of milk for 2 weeks before she said a single word to her about helping, and by then Edie had already begun helping, had begun observing the hogs with a close, unblinking attention, and had named every one of them, not in the way children name pets, but in the careful, functional way of someone keeping a record, each name describing a quality or a habit she had noticed. The biggest, darkest, most deliberate of the hogs she named Plum, because he always went straight, always moved in a line, always seemed to know exactly where he was heading. Clara thought that was right. She put it in her notebook. By April, the hogs had worked the low southeast corner of the 40 acres into something Clara had expected but could not have proven in advance. The churned ground, exposed by their rooting to the air and the wet spring light, was releasing nutrients from the clay layer beneath in a way that the surface grass had never been able to access. And the new growth coming up in the disturbed soil was richer and darker than anything the field had shown before. She planted a trial of turnips in 12 of those churned rows, and potatoes in 8 more, and a half-acre of field corn in the flattest section where the drainage was best. Benedek Farkas came down from the ridge in May and walked the planted ground with her, and looked at the color of the new growth, and said, without particular drama, "The broken place feeds what grows in it. The wound is where the vein runs." She nodded. She had already known it for months, but hearing it again settled something in her. She did not tell anyone what the low corner was giving back. She had found, during her winter walks, that the limestone shelf in the southeast quadrant was fractured, and that along the fracture line, the iron content of the soil was exceptional. Not just the surface iron smell she had noticed in October, but a deep, consistent, mineral-dense seam that the hogs were pulling up in chunks with their snouts. Dark, reddish clay mixed with something heavier. And she had taken 3 samples of this material in her coat pockets and carried them to the agricultural college 40 miles away in March, and spoken to a young soil chemist there who had examined them for 2 hours and then sat down and looked at her carefully and told her that the mineral content of what she had brought him was unusual and that she should not discuss it widely. She thanked him and drove home in the borrowed wagon, and did not discuss it widely. She was not a secretive person by nature, but she understood the arithmetic of information in a county where men like Rutherford Gaines controlled the price of land, and she knew that a thing kept quiet is a thing kept safe until it is ready to be seen. Gaines owned the grain elevator and held mortgages on 11 of the 16 farms within 5 miles of Clara's 40 acres, and he had made his money the way institutional men make money in tight communities, by being the only buyer and the only lender, and by offering terms that were charitable enough to accept and punishing enough to keep a man perpetually short. He was 54 years old and had not done physical work in 20 years, and carried the smooth confidence of a person who has confused the appearance of power with the thing itself. He had driven past Clara's property a dozen times in the first year she was there, and had stopped twice to speak to her across the fence, offering to buy the 40 acres, the first time at $150, which was an insult framed as a rescue, and the second time at $300, which was the original purchase price framed as charity. Both times Clara had been polite, and both times she had said the land was not for sale, and both times Gaines had driven away with the expression of a man who cannot decide whether he is amused or offended and has settled on both. The summer of the first year passed in labor that Clara recorded in her notebook with the same careful precision she brought to everything: 47 jars of pickled turnip by late July, 61 jars of potato by August, the corn coming in short but clean, sufficient for her own use and for the hogs through the winter. With a small surplus, she sold quietly to a farm family 2 miles north for $11. The hogs gained weight through the summer on the churned bottomland forage, and she sold 3 of them in the fall for a combined $38 and put the money in a tin box under the root cellar floor and noted it in the notebook. $49 total income for the year after expenses, against costs of $63, including the original seed and feed, and the lumber for the house addition she had built in August. She was $14 short. She looked at this figure in her notebook for a long time one evening in October, the 2nd October on the 40 acres, with the lamplight low and the hogs breathing in the pen outside. Then she turned the page and wrote at the top of the next one, "The arithmetic of surviving is not the arithmetic of quitting." The second year she added 6 more hogs, bringing the herd to 15, and moved the rooting rotation to include the northeast quarter of the field, which she had held back the first year to give it time to drain. The mineral seam she had identified ran southwest to northeast along the fracture line, and as the hogs worked their way up the field through the second spring, she found the seam thickening and the soil changing character above it, turning from pale clay to a darker, denser material that held moisture differently, and she brought another 2 samples to the college that March and the young soil chemist looked at them for half an afternoon and told her the concentration was increasing and that she ought to think carefully about what she intended to do, because what she had might be of interest to people who dealt in industrial minerals, and that those people were not always the kind you wanted arriving uninvited. She thanked him again and drove home, and thought about it for several weeks, and then wrote a single line in her notebook: "When a thing is ready, it will announce itself. Not before." Edie Marsh was 11 now and had been coming to the farm every morning since February of the first year, and had learned by close observation and Clara's occasional instruction how to read the hogs' behavior as a diagnostic tool, which patches of ground they returned to, which sections they avoided, how the quality of what they rooted up changed with the season and the depth. She had also learned by this time that the big dark hog she had named Plum was extraordinary in a way that even Clara had not fully anticipated. He had a sensitivity to the mineral seam that was almost architectural, moving along it in a long, slow arc each morning before beginning to root, as though he were reading a line that only he could see. Clara had started marking Plum's daily path with small wooden stakes and recording it in her notebook, and by the second autumn she had a detailed map of the fracture line that was more precise than anything a surveyor could have given her without weeks of work and expensive equipment. Edie had made this observation before Clara had. She had said simply, one morning in July, "Plum knows where it goes." Clara had looked at the child for a moment, and then at the hog, and then she had written it down. Plum knows where it goes. The county's opinion of Clara Voss had not improved in the second year, but it had shifted in register from outright mockery to a more uneasy variety of dismissal, the kind that contains a small, uncomfortable kernel of doubt. Her turnip and potato yield was talked about at the feed store with the studied nonchalance of people who do not want to be impressed and are slightly annoyed that they are. Gaines stopped at the fence again in November of the second year, and this time he offered $500 for the 40 acres, and when Clara declined, he stood at the fence for a longer moment than usual and looked at the hogs in the field with an expression that she registered and filed away. It was not pity, it was calculation. He was measuring something he could not quite see yet, but suspected was worth measuring. She said nothing that would help him measure it. The third year the reckoning came for the rest of the county, and it came in the form of a blight that moved through the improved breed hog operations in the region with the systematic efficiency of something that had been waiting for precisely the conditions those operations had created. The fashionable breeds that Gaines and several other large operations kept in close confinement, the sleek, grain-dependent, pampered animals that consistently won at fairs and brought premium prices at market, turned out to be precisely the wrong animals for what the summer and fall delivered. A wet summer, followed by a drought that cracked the feed pastures, followed by a fungal respiratory illness that moved through the confined pens with terrible speed. By October of the third year, 7 of the 9 large hog operations in Harlan County had lost between a third and 2/3 of their animals, and the price of pork at the local market had swung violently upward while the supply of breeding stock had crashed. Men who had been certain and prosperous in June were counting carcasses in October and talking to Gaines about their mortgages in the flat, careful voices of people who already know what the answer will be. Clara Voss's herd of 15 mixed-breed bottomland hogs did not get sick. They had been rooting through wet low ground for 3 years, had built immune constitutions that no pampered, pen-bred animal could match, had been eating a varied mineral-dense diet that the fractured limestone soil of her 40 acres had been providing through everything the hogs turned up, and when the fungal illness moved through the county, they went through their days unchanged, broad and dark and deliberate, pushing their flat snouts into the earth with their usual patience. By November, she had 21 animals, having had a successful farrowing in the spring, and all 21 were healthy and heavy, and exactly what every farmer in Harlan County suddenly needed and could not find. The requests began quietly and became loud. 2 farmers came to her fence in the same week, men who had nodded at her with the polite indifference of people acknowledging someone they have already written off, and stood there now with their hats in their hands and asked if she would sell breeding pairs. She sold them 2 pairs at $31 a pair and watched them drive away, and wrote the $62 in her notebook and then wrote beneath it, "It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it." She had written that line before, months earlier, thinking about something Benedict Farkas had said, and she wrote it again now because it seemed to be the mechanism by which the county was rotating, slowly and painfully, from contempt toward something like respect, and she wanted to remember the exact texture of the rotation because it had a lesson in it that she intended to use. Gaines came to the fence again in late November of the third year, and he did not look comfortable about it. He had lost 40% of his show herd to the illness, had spent money on veterinary treatment that had not worked, and was now looking at the north end of his operation with the expression of a man recalculating his position. He offered her $900 for the 40 acres and said it was a fair price for flood-prone bottomland, and she said the land was not for sale. He said he could make it 1,000, and she said it was not a matter of the number. He looked at the hogs for a while and then looked at her and said she was being difficult, and she said she did not think so. He drove away. 3 days later, one of the men who had flanked him at various fence-line conversations appeared at her gate asking to buy one of her boars, a large intact male she had not listed for sale, and offered her a price that was precisely $3 more than she had mentioned to Idy's grandmother the previous Sunday at church. A figure she had not stated publicly anywhere, a figure that could only have reached Gaines through someone listening carefully to a conversation they were not part of. She noted the price in her notebook, underlined it, and sold the man a different animal at a different price, and said nothing about the discrepancy. Idy Marsh was 12 by this time, and had the focused, economy of motion quality of a child who has spent 2 years learning something real, and she came to Clara that evening after the man had left and said he knew the number from Sunday. Clara looked at her for a moment and said yes. Idy said Mr. Gaines. Clara said yes. They both looked at the hogs for a while, the animals moving in the last of the November light, Plum at the far end of the field walking his slow, diagnostic arc. Clara wrote in her notebook, "A man who knows the price you haven't named has been standing somewhere you didn't see him." By the 4th January, the soil chemist from the college came to the farm himself, unannounced, driving a small truck with an assistant in the passenger seat. And he walked the southeast corner of the field with her for 3 hours with instruments she had never seen, and dug 11 test holes along the line she had mapped from Plum's daily walks, and filled 12 glass sample tubes with material from each hole, and told her, standing in the cold field with the hogs watching from the far end, that what the 40 acres was sitting on was a mineral deposit of significant commercial value, specifically a concentration of iron-rich siderite interspersed with a clay body that also contained measurable deposits of something the industrial market was currently paying very well for, and that she would need a minerals attorney, and that he could recommend one, and that she should not sign any papers with anyone before speaking to that attorney. He looked at her with a directness that she respected. He said, "You knew." She said, "I suspected." He said, "Since when?" She said, "October of the first year, the second day I walked the field." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the specific admiration of someone who has just measured a long patience and found it longer than they expected. She retained the minerals attorney that February, a woman named Hargrove, who practiced in the county seat and who read the test results with a concentration that matched Clara's own, and who then spent 6 weeks filing the proper claims and establishing Clara's mineral rights in the legally binding way that would hold regardless of what anyone else subsequently attempted. The filing cost $220, which represented nearly the whole of Clara's cash reserve, and she paid it without hesitation because she understood that the arithmetic of protection is cheaper than the arithmetic of loss, and she wrote this in her notebook as well. Benedek Farkas came down from the ridge in March of the 4th year and walked the field with her and looked at the test holes that had been refilled and tamped, and looked at the hogs working the mineral seam in the way they always had, unhurried and exact. And he said, "The wound is where the vein runs." The way he said it this time was different from the first time, quieter, more final, like a person reading the last line of something they had been reading for a long time. Clara looked at the hogs and then looked at the ridge above and then back at the old man and said, "You knew what was down there?" Benedek Farkas was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I knew the ground was broken in the way that broken ground sometimes is, worth what you could not yet see. I did not know the particulars. I knew the character." She nodded. They stood in the field in the March wind for a while longer, and then she made him coffee in the small house, and they sat at the table, and he drank it and said nothing more, and she was grateful for that. It was in late October of the 4th year that Rutherford Gaines appeared with his motor car and his 2 men and his leather satchel and his $4,200 offer, the offer she had already declined twice in preliminary correspondence through the attorney Hargrove, and was declining now in person at the fence line while she kept her eyes on the hogs in the pale morning light. He had arrived at the offer, she knew, through a calculation that was shrewd but incomplete. He had heard enough from enough quarters to know the land had mineral value, had spoken to someone at the county recorder's office who had told him about the mineral rights filing, and had assembled from these fragments a partial picture that told him the land was worth more than he had previously believed, but did not tell him how much more, because the detailed assay results were in Hargrove's files and not in any public record. His offer of $4,200 was a number designed to feel generous to a woman he assumed was desperate and isolated, a number that felt like charity while being, from his perspective, a potential acquisition of something worth 10 or 20 times that if his partial picture was close to correct. Clara had run the full arithmetic. She had run it in her notebook over 3 evenings in September with the assay documents and Hargrove's letters and her own 4 years of observational records, and the figure she had arrived at was not $4,200, It was not 20,000. The deposit beneath her 40 acres, the fractured limestone shelf with its iron-rich siderite and its companion mineral body, had been assessed by the industrial buyer that Hargrove had contacted as a resource with a projected extraction value of between $60,000 and $90,000 over the life of the deposit, with the mineral lease terms that Hargrove had drafted offering Clara 40% of extraction revenue and full surface restoration rights. The lease was already drafted. Hargrove had already received a signed letter of intent from the industrial buyer. There was no number in Gaines's leather satchel that bore any relationship to reality. She let him stand behind her at the fence for a long time, the way you let a thing finish running its course before you address it. Then she turned. She looked at him with the same directness she brought to reading soil, which is to say without hostility and without performance, just clear, honest appraisal. She said, "Mr. Gaines, the land is not for sale at any figure you are prepared to offer, and I think you know enough by now to understand why, though you do not know enough to know how much why there is." He looked at her. His expression moved through several things. She said, "But I will tell you what I am prepared to do, which is to sell you 50 pounds of seed stock from my root herd at a fair price, not a charity price, because your operation lost animals this fall as others did, and you will need to rebuild, and the animals that survived this county's trouble are the ones descended from the stock you and every other man of standing here dismissed as worthless 3 years ago, and now they are the most valuable breeding animals in the region, and I am the only person who has them in the numbers you would need." He said, "What price?" She said, $30 a pair, the same price I offered everyone else. 11 pairs, $330 total. He looked at her for a long moment, and the leather satchel under his arm seemed to become heavier as she watched. He said, "And the land," she said, "belongs to the minerals and to me, and to whatever grows in the wound of it. That is not a negotiation. He bought the breeding pairs." He stood at the gate on a gray November morning 2 weeks later, and Edie Marsh counted the animals into the truck with the quiet authority of a child who has named every one of them and knows their individual gaits and temperaments, and Clara collected the $330 and wrote it in her notebook with the date and Gaines's name, and beside his name she wrote nothing editorial, just the number, because the number was its own editorial. He did not say anything when he left that could be called gracious, but he did not say anything contemptuous either, and Clara noted the absence of contempt as its own form of accounting. He was not a man who could be shamed into generosity. He was a man who had been outmaneuvered by patience and could feel the shape of it even if he could not articulate it. The mineral lease was signed in December of the 4th year, 62 days after the fence line conversation, and the first extraction payment arrived in March, $11,040, which was Clara's 40% of the first quarter's royalty from the industrial buyer, who had sent 3 engineers and a crew of 14 to begin the careful work of removing what lay below the 40 acres, drilling and extracting with the surface restoration conditions written into every clause of the agreement, so that what came out of the ground came out cleanly, and what remained above was returned to its contour and would be ready in time for other uses. She paid Hargrove her full fee of $800 and put $1,800 into a savings account in the county seat bank and paid $312 in taxes and improvements and put the rest in the tin box under the root cellar floor alongside the small accumulated savings of 4 years, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. The arithmetic now read differently, not the arithmetic of surviving, but the arithmetic of having arrived at a place she had seen, dimly and with uncertainty. On the second day she walked the grid of the 40 acres 4 years before, when she had pressed the dark clay back with her heel and stood up and kept walking, because it was not yet time to know what she was seeing. She invited Benedek Farkas to supper in January, the January after the lease was signed, and cooked a meal that used the last of the root cellar's best stores, the heavy good food of a winter kitchen, and they sat at the table where they had sat before, and he drank his coffee, and she poured herself a second cup, and they talked about the spring, what she would plant, how the hogs would be managed now that the extraction crew was on the southeast quadrant. He said, "And the hogs stay." She said, "The hogs stay." He smiled at that, the small, quiet smile of a person whose theory has been confirmed. He said, "The wound is where the vein runs." She said, "Yes." He said, "And now the wound is closing and the vein is paid out. What is left?" She thought about it for a moment. She said, "The ground that was broken is the best ground now." He nodded. He said, "This is always how it is." He put his cup down and looked out the window at the dark field and at the silhouettes of the hogs moving in the cold, and said, "One person alone in the beginning. But the beginning is not the whole of it." And she knew he meant not just herself, meant Edie counting animals at the gate, and himself walking the ridge above for a decade, and the soil chemist with his glass tubes, and Hargrove with her careful language in the mineral rights documents, meant the whole network of unflashy patient people who had contributed their particular seeing to a thing the county had written off before it had a chance to become what it was. Edie Marsh was 13 in January, and she came to the farm on the Saturday following the supper and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was mostly milk and a biscuit, and said to Clara without preamble, "Plum found a new line last week." Clara looked up from the notebook. She said, "Where?" Edie described it in the exact economical language she had developed over 3 years of observation, direction, and distance from the fence line, and approximate depth based on the character of the rooting, and Clara wrote it down and looked at it and said, "I will walk it tomorrow morning." Edie nodded. She said, "It goes northeast, past the creek line." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She said, "That would be off the 40 acres." Edie said, "Yes." The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of two people recognizing something they are not ready to say yet, the kind that contains the next several years of effort, folded quiet and patient, as something banked under ash, waiting for the right amount of air. The county spoke differently about Clara Voss by the spring of the 5th year, not with the embarrassed excess of people converting from contempt to admiration, which would have been its own kind of noise, but with the quieter register of a community that has rearranged the furniture of its opinion and is living in the changed room and pretending it was always arranged this way. The feed store conversations had a different texture. People asked her opinion on drainage and on soil and on animal husbandry, in the tone of questions asked of someone whose answers are expected to be worth hearing. Two of the farmers who had come to her fence with their hats in their hands in the 3rd autumn came to supper in February and sat at her table and ate her food and talked about the spring planting with the openness of people who have decided to stop protecting themselves from being wrong. She was not sentimental about this. She noted it, the way she noted everything, as information about how a community rotates, and she was glad of it, and she was also clear-eyed about its limits, because she had learned in 4 years of close observation that it is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, and the admission, when it finally comes, does not always arrive in the form of words. She expanded the operation that spring. 31 hogs now, 2 more acres under root vegetables, a market arrangement with a buyer in the county seat who paid 30% above local price for the quality and consistency of what her bottomland produced. She hired Edie's grandmother to keep accounts 2 days a week, paying her $8 a month, which was fair and which the old woman accepted with a dignity that matched Clara's own. And she hired a young man of 17 who needed work and had proved himself willing to observe before acting, which was the quality she required above any other. She was 45 years old. She had 4 years of notebooks and a mineral lease, and a herd of 31 mixed-breed animals, and 40 acres of the best-worked low ground in Harlan County, and 1 friend on the ridge above, and 1 13-year-old girl who could read the ground through a hog's behavior as though the earth were speaking a language Edie had been born knowing. On a morning in late March she walked the field alone at first light, the hogs still in the pen, the ground soft from an overnight rain, the air carrying that particular smell of early spring soil that is the smell of possibility before it has committed to anything. She walked the grid she had walked the first time, the same 40-pace rows, turning at the fence line. But now she knew every inch of it, knew its drainage and its mineral character and its productive capacity and its quirks, knew it the way you know a thing you have attended with patience over time, and she walked it not to learn it, but to confirm what she already knew, which is a different and deeper kind of walking. She stopped at the southeast corner, the corner where the seam had been, the extraction site now quiet and graded, and beginning to show the first green of restorative grass where the crew had seeded it back in January, and she crouched and pressed her fingers into the new soil the way she had pressed them into the old soil 4 years before, and felt its warmth and its weight and its drainage. And she thought about what Benedek Farkas had said. The wound is where the vein runs, and the wound is closing, and the ground that was broken is the best ground now. And what is left after the reckoning is not the ruin of the thing, but the thing itself, made better by having been attended to. She stood up and looked out at the field in the early light and thought, one person alone in the beginning. But the beginning is not the whole of it. The hogs would be turned out in an hour. Edie would arrive before that, would arrive the way she always arrived, quietly, and at exactly the right moment, and Plum would begin his slow diagnostic arc along the northeastern line that went past the creek boundary, past the edge of the 40 acres, into whatever the next chapter of the arithmetic was. The morning was cold and clear and full of the particular light that comes in late March when the earth is deciding, and Clara Voss stood in it and felt, with a precision that had nothing to do with sentimentality, the accounts of the last 4 years balancing themselves in a long, slow column that had taken its own time to add up and had now arrived at a figure she could look at straight. Not a fortune exactly, but something better, which is the knowledge that the broken thing you chose to attend, when everyone told you it was worthless, has become the root from which everything still growing draws its strength, and that this, finally, is the arithmetic that matters, the arithmetic of a life built on what others could not see, patient and exact and altogether hers.